Welcome to UberCube, the podcast where we discuss all things cube, but with refreshments. This is your host, Anthony Adams, aka UberBear, and I'm joined tonight by my other host,
May, also known as Miagic.
And we've got a fun we're going to do some meta, we're going to do some free flow conversation, because today, Magic, as we discussed, is my birthday. So go short.
It is.
It's my birthday. Go short.
And I have a special present for you.
You do?
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Anthony. Happy birthday to you.
Thank you so much for that. That
You're
pulls
welcome.
my heartstrings. It is currently November the 15th at the date of this recording, and I couldn't have got a more special gift. So thank you. That warms my heart. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
But we're going to have kind of this free flow conversation about how you as a curator try to piecemeal or bring together your cube as a sum of its parts and break outside of those, I guess, the restrictions or the expectations of the players from, say, the plane that you're in, whether it be Innistrad or Mirrodin or Kaladesh or any of these planes, right? How do you get outside of that scope and expand to your own version of the universes beyond, but from a curator's perspective? But before we go any further, May, we're going to do the thing that we always do. We're going to enjoy our libations of the show. May, what are you having on this delightful evening?
I am going for a little bit more of a relaxed vibe to fit the tone. I am having some jasmine hibiscus tea.
Nice. That sounds delicious. So, it is my birthday. And because it's my birthday, I am having a Florida man, because I'm in Clearwater, Florida during this time of recording. You may notice a difference, right? So I picked up a Florida man by Cigar City Brewing, and it is defined as a tribute to the world's worst superhero. May. Yes. If you haven't done this, just not completely thought-provoking exercise, I want you to do a thing for me. I want you to humor me. Anybody that hasn't done this, it's pretty funny. I would have to credit my little son. It's a meme on the internet. My son, Caden, has told me, Dad, you have to type in on the internet, in Google or some search engine, your birthday and Florida man, and then see what the news broadcast said from that day from a major broadcast station of sorts, say CBS or whatever. May, would you mind humoring me and pull up your Florida man and just in homage to this wonderful beer that I'm about to crack open?
So apparently, my Florida man is someone who flashed their butt at an IHOP after impersonating a police officer to get free food. It sounds painfully Florida.
I have considered trying that myself, but I feel like you're not going to get those magic waffles whenever you do that, right? My Florida man from Boynton Beach, and this is as per CVS Miami. South Florida police are searching for a man captured on video helping himself to a snack as he robbed a Taco Bell in the Boynton Beach Mall. They believe he is responsible for at least 2 other burglaries within the past month. Turns out the crook not only went for the cash, but he couldn't resist the pre-fried tostada shell as well.
Sure.
Yeah, so here we are. This is what you do, I guess. And
he was hungry.
For those listeners in Florida, I love this state. It's gorgeous. This is only purely in jest. We're not meant to make fun, but to have a little bit of fun here, right? Every state's got its meme.
Oh, they know. They embrace
every
it.
state has its meme. So I'm going to go ahead and crack open this Florida man. Here we go. All right, let's go. So May.
Me.
The topic, the center of this topic, actually comes from a multitude of conversations from myself as a curator, where I have taken on universes, right? Planes that have expectations, whether it be UberBear's Horror Cube or UberBear's Artifact Cube. When I make those type of announcements, let me just go and do this. When I say UberBear's Horror Cube, what's the first plane that comes to your mind?
It's usually going to be Innistrad.
Right. And whenever I say UberBear's Artifact Cube, what's the multitude of planes that comes to your mind?
I feel bad for saying for like Mirrodin and Kaladesh.
So would you say, in your opinion, it's easy to set a tone whenever you make those announcements that you're some kind of, in my case, a limited set cube? Like the tonnage of the cards that you would find within said environment would totally match by those two tones. You as a Magic player would make the assumption, right, through that lens, that you're going to find cards within that plane. Do you agree with that statement?
I'm actually going to follow it up with my own statement, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
Where the hardest part about designing these types of environments, not just from a cube curation standpoint, but also from a Wizards of the Coast standpoint, is it's hard to revisit themes without them making the same that it was, if that makes sense. So I have a very specific example. Eldraine is one of the key fairy tale environments, but when they were making that, a lot of the struggles was making it different from Lorwyn, right? And trying to make Eldraine its own thing is a difficult task. It is not an easy thing to ask of a designer to do. And when people have that expectation that you've set before, or that's already been set before, us as cube curators, we have to kind of adapt into that by learning how to either work through that expectation or with that expectation. So it is not 100%. Easy.
Yeah, so I think there's a storytelling element that's completely like attached to that idea. And then for us as curators, if we want to take, like, we'll say, for example, Lorwyn and in the Fey Cube, right? But you want to expand it into a universe. We've talked about this on numerous occasions. We even joked about it. Like I threw some jabs in your general direction about, like, in pure jest about the Fey Cube, and that you've made a universe, right? But when I made a joke, like we called it the Lorwyn Eldraine or Eldraine Ruin or something like that, I made like a funny like combination of the words. You're like, right? Because that's not what your design intent is as the curator. But when people see certain fairies and certain cards, they form like hard-based opinions about what they should find.
Right.
So I have a secondary follow-up question, and this is going to be pointed towards me. It's going to be introspective here, but I'm going to push it back from you, right? I'm going to have you answer it. Do you think, in your opinion, when I choose the word horror or I choose the word artifact as the, Uberbear's horror, Uberbear's artifact, where I'm trying to say like what I'm trying to do as a base, do you feel like that creates a bias for you as a drafter, right? Like what you're expecting to find within said environment?
I mean, as my individual opinion, very explicitly mine, is that I see your horror cube and your artifact cube as kind of polar opposite expectations, where we're expecting horror cube to be a thematic idea. Usually it's going to be around the spooky cube type, Innistrad-esque plane, and when people are looking at that, they are expecting it to be mostly Innistrad. And when you have that expectation, it's hard to work around that. But on the other degree, when you say artifact cube, people are more inclined to feel that it is more adjacent to like how the Devoid Cube is, where somehow the artifacts are part of that mechanical identity, and that's where people can get those cross readings from what you're trying to present.
So do you think that the name association, the title of the cube, directly correlates to the expectation? I guess that's
Oh, definitely.
Right. So
it is the most presentable piece of information that we can give.
Right. Besides as you talked about, like on the Lucky Paper episode where you guys talked about the importance of a TLDR, the assumption is that people are going to stop and read that, right? So if we use CubeCon 2023 as an example, those primers were placed up for a long duration, and the people that were looking to gain the most knowledge took the time to review, because we got this kind of feedback, to review those primers so they understood the environmental context of what they were trying to take on, and that they could, I don't want to say spike it, but so the people that wanted to win would look to find out what the power outliers, and those that wanted to embrace the story had a different tone. Does that make sense?
Oh, definitely. I had both of those types of players for mine.
Yes. So for me as a curator, just laying it out there, right? I see a direct correlation to the reader-writer relationship in this naming convention, in this tone. As in, the writer writes a story, and I've talked about this numerous occasions where I personally like to write. Most people don't know this about me, but I like doing a lot of short stories and novellas. I've kind of, in the recent, haven't actually pursued that passion of mine because I've got other passions, right? But I like to write a story, but I felt like as the writer, a lot of times when you look at that type of dynamic, the publishers and things like that get involved to make sure that the name of the book contextualizes the idea behind what the intent of the story is, right? So that if you have a Stephen King novel or a Dean Koontz novel and he calls it Watchers, for example, we'll use Watchers. Like, that's a great book, one of my favorite books of all time. It doesn't really explain what the book is intending to do, whereas Dickens and Great Expectations really kind of lays out the overarching themes of the story of Great Expectations. Does that make sense? They're two different buckets of storytelling. So whenever I named my cubes, I kind of set the tonnage or the bias because I wanted to, we'll do the horror cube. Like, the horror cube was pretty on the base. I wanted to embrace a gothic horror theme, and there was no name that I could truly think of that would explain that in 3 words, right? Like, that one I felt like was pretty straightforward. The artifact cube, when I call it Uberbear's artifact cube, the expectation is it's just going to have a high density of artifacts. The bias is actually created by me as the writer, right? So when the reader reads it, they can make some pretty fair assumptions. Would you agree with that statement?
Sure. Yeah, sure. I can agree, because it's a similar concept in things like graphic design and etc., where we're trying to display the information, because Cube is, in a way, an outlet creatively to take something and turn it into something else. And when we are using these naming adages, we're trying to create a way to translate those thoughts and feelings in a concise but also a evocative kind of way. So,
right, something that drives that point. So I've got my friend Sandwich, who's working right now to expand a 180 cube, and he called it Sandwich's Soul Tie Cube, and it was 180 at the time. However, he wants to, and he has since expanded it to a 360 because he wants to brand it so that he could publish it for CubeCon. So my first response is, hey, Chris, he was on our peasant cube discussion, our Pauper cube discussion. We actually had this discussion via text over the last 2 days, and I said, I just don't think that Sandwich's Soul Tie Cube embodies the expectation. Most people will say, it'll be green, black, and blue. But it doesn't really tell a story, right? Because I believe in the marketing aspect of the story. So we were kind of brainstorming amongst ourselves, and he finally came to the conclusion, and I love this name. It's a little gross. So if you're eating right now, Bug Sandwich, I think is what he called it.
Perfect.
Yeah, right? And it's kind of just embodies the idea. He got the name of the curator engaged in that idea. So everybody knows it has an identifier, so they know who invented this concept, who built it, and then they can just derive from that it's so many things to break apart there. Then Bug, it kind of relays the color spectrum of the 3 colors that he wants to do from that. I guess it's a shard, right? Is that a shard? I think you get the idea what I'm saying. The trifecta of colors.
Black, blue, green. Yes.
And then in addition to, by that name that's mildly revolting, kind of explains if you want to deep dive into it, the graveyard synergies and whatnot that he's wanting to do with that idea, right? That's kind of what those colors actually embrace anyways. So in that naming convention, by marketing it, to me as the reader, that says a lot. And you could dissect it that way. But he hasn't shoehorned himself or don't put baby in a corner. He hasn't come up with a title that pushes you into No Way Out, so you can kind of derive what the intent is there. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. And it's a wedge, not a shard.
Okay, we'll go with it's a wedge, it's a shard. Yeah, that
they're the same thing.
To me, it's similar, but people are going to argue the semantics with me. But I skipped that entire portion of Magic, right? So
sure.
I took this hiatus in Magic. I started playing in late 96, early 97, somewhere in there in the Air Force. We talked about this before. And then once I got out in 2001, I had nobody to play Magic with. So I took like this huge 12-year hiatus. So these names where all these different blocks happen and all that were just lost on me. And I've had to play catch up ever since, right? So yeah, Shard, Wedge. Yeah, it is what it is to me. But for me, it's just the Sultai group now, right? Based on, what was that?
That was Khans of Tarkir.
So you get the idea, right? But his name really embodies a lot of things. And I think it's snappy, it's fast. If someone look at it, they can make a lot of assumptions. Whereas Uberbear's Artifact Cube, I think by that name, I've created my own subset of pitfalls because I didn't have a name that really wanted to tell what I wanted to do. Because you look at my TLDR, which you guys have talked about, my original design intent was anti versus artifact, right? Like in which it's grown since. At the time of its original inception, I kind of wanted this like thin red line of, and it didn't work, right? My idea didn't work. It was proven not to work on a multitude of occasions, not only within my play group, but also obviously CubeCon #1, where I thought I could have this, you play artifacts and maybe a couple other people play artifacts, but those other people would be this other subset, this other faction that I hates artifacts, right? Like that was my vision, but it didn't come to realization because people splashed it.
To give you some credit.
Yeah.
To give you some credit. I don't think that it's a case that you created the pitfall by setting just the expectation of it's an artifact cube, but you're being punished for being artifacts, but you were doing a thing that was already being done in Magic, because with like Mirrodin and New Phyrexia and etc., a lot of those, you were playing artifacts. Here's the anti-artifact cards was a very strong mechanic of those sets and a very strong theme. And it's why it came back with, what was it? One Will Be All? Whatever it said it was, where it had for Mirrodin as a mechanic. But point is that it is a very strong theme that does get pushed and tried a lot by Wizards of the Coast. But I do agree that when you mention Artifact Cube, people go in with the expectation of playing the Artifact deck rather than being punished for doing the thing that says on the box.
I would say that I tried to communicate the best I could the idea of the cube, but because of that name, when I presented the cube, and it's been 2 times now at CubeCon, it had an expectation, right? Like equipment, modular. People expect to find those things because they have these preordained concepts of what the planes did that highly support those by Wizards of the Coast.
Right.
But me as a curator, I'm trying to find ways to make my own plane, to kind of march my own path. I'm trying to be a pathfinder, to take an idea that's an old idea and then reinvent it, right? And so one of the struggles that I find as a curator, and I kind of want to put some context to this, my play group, my meta, understands and has the time for my storytelling. So as I present, let's say, we talked about this in a previous episode, when I put it on a platter and I present it and I go, this is the Munson Cube, right? And I tell everybody that we're going to play metal while playing this Jun Cube, that I try to find these art pieces. It's more of an artistic cube than it is actually the sum of its parts. And then whenever I present it to my group and I put on some Metallica or death metal of some sort or whatever, and I serve everybody a glass of whiskey, it sets a tone, right? But when I take that same cube and if I move it to a different environment and I go to a game store where I can't have loud music playing and I can't present the bourbons and whiskeys that I would traditionally do, it becomes a Jund cube with kind of a little shtick. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So the storytelling kind of gets absorbed by the environment and the new players. Would you agree with that idea or that concept?
So what's difficult about something like the Munson Cube in particular is that there are a lot of external expression pieces that you are trying to convey. And like we mentioned earlier, it's our cubes creatively transform a bunch of cards into an environment for people to play. We are trying to curate a kind of play experience rather than a set in stone set of mechanics all the time. But in the case of your Munson Cube, a lot of that flavor gets lost when your environment can't really flourish in that way because you don't have those external tools anymore. And I would make a case that, let's say we took a bar cube and tried to submit it somehow, because we're not allowed to like edit cards for them, right? But in the case of CubeCon, let's say we took a bar cube and submitted it and put it up to 360. We had a bunch of the edited cards. That's all fine. But it doesn't translate the same way of being told, hey, this is a bar cube, and then everybody's going to look at these cards and they're going to be like, I don't get it. Where is the flavor? Where is the connection here? As opposed to that external factor being the bar, being the no playmats, being the no tokens, no counters, etc. It is the point of, we are bringing this into an environment where we usually don't play Magic. And that external component creates that play experience. And when you take the heavy metal out of a Munson cube, then it removes a core piece of its identity. And it's difficult.
I would agree with that. So using, for example, we talked about our good friend Dan Schneider, who he and I had a long talk about his strategy as to how to best navigate Uberbear's artifact cube. It came down to using the no artifact, no thematic components as the creature sources, where they weren't threatened by the idea of the disenchants and the naturalizes. So by him using that theory, he wanted to apply it to see if he's going for the race. He wanted to get the win out of it, right? Which I totally respect. But me as a curator, I saw this, again, going back to the thin red line, which has now been shifted. You know, the latitude and longitudes have now been moved with that concept, where Selesnya was the original threat. But as the curator, I'm trying to, I guess, embrace that idea of people who want to push those borders, push those concepts, but I don't want it to become the status quo. How do you do that? My question for you, May, is how do you do that as a curator? How do you want your story to be, I guess, totally embraced by your listeners the best you can, or rather your players?
Ultimately, there's an expression that's used a lot. You probably have heard of it, but the customer is always right, and the part that gets always cut off in terms of taste. And when it comes to... Yeah. And when people are playing Cube, they're going to have specific tastes, and they're going to have specific things that they're looking for within that environment. And somebody's not going to be given a peanut butter jelly sandwich and then be like, actually, I don't like peanut butter. You know?
Right.
The expectation is very clear of, this is a peanut butter jelly sandwich. I have peanut butter, jelly, and bread. Here's your peanut butter sandwich. Actually, I don't like that. It's not an exchange that happens because that's easily translated from the name to the actual item. For Cube, there's a lot more steps in between because, you know, Magic's a complicated game. There's a complicated form of art and mechanics and whatnot. And when you have something that's so complicated, it's hard to create something that is evocative enough, but also on point enough that you can set those expectations right from the get-go. And there was a specific comment that you have mentioned that got sent to you on Discord. Correct. About a draft of your horror cube, and it was talking a lot about power differentials, and I've been thinking about that one a lot. But I'm going to go ahead and read it if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So the integers said, personally, I was really confused by the power level differentials here, and I felt like the Innistrad draft archetype stuff like random wolves, mild graveyard synergies didn't quite add up to the power of standalone cards that are powerful in legacy vintage cubes, etc. Skyclave, Apparition, disorienting as a drafter to see cards that are head and shoulders above most of the rest of the cubes, like Ancient Tomb and Force of Will. So, what's interesting about this, and what's even had me thinking about it for a bit, is that it is a signal of a disconnect of intention, I suppose. When you are curating a sort of storytelling environment, or a sort of, I don't want to say performative, I want to say curated experience that you're presenting to people, right? It is hard when they get disconnected, when they're trying to embrace a lot of those Innistrad, a lot of those horror themes, etc., and a lot of those low-power things, but then having those random outliers like Force of Will and Ancient Tomb. And I do agree that in terms of being a good play experience, that Yeah, getting rid of those is probably correct. But what's hard is that as curators, we want to add cards like those because they fit a certain flavor profile that we're looking for. And I have specific examples in the Fey Cube, like Once Upon a Time. We know how strong Once Upon a Time is. But another good example is Fact or Fiction, cutting myself off for a second. But between Once Upon a Time and Fact or Fiction, these are powerful cards. We all know that they're good cards. But I'm not going to take them out of the Fey Cube because they are core to what they do without it being oppressive or being so far out of the curve that it prevents the cube from functioning. And that is where it's a hard line to maintain as a curator, where we're trying to use certain pieces that happen to fit the certain flavor that we're looking for or the certain artistic vision that we have without it being a huge power outlier, and that's difficult.
A counterpoint to that conversation is I presented this to my play group, and I will add that since CubeCon, we talked about this in a previous episode, I have removed Ancient Tomb. And Ancient Tomb, I got some pushback from my individual play group, from my circle of 8 to 12 on the removal of it. But the gist is because it gave you fast mana, and it pushed you into the Talisman, which on turn 1 you could drop that, and then tap, bring in a Talisman, and by turn 2 you could have the production of 3 mana. So it was just quickening the plays a little bit faster than what the rest of the cube does, right? It gave you access to a lot of mana. So that one, you have no pushback from me or anybody in my group. Once I explained that made total sense, right? That was kind of that was an overarching theme that I actually got from moving around CubeCon, asking players about my environment when they thought about it. But then let's move to Skyclave Apparition. Skyclave Apparition, for 1 colorless and 2 planes, you get a creature, Core Spirit. If you want to know what, like, me as a curator and the type of idea that I'm trying to do, right, the Gothic horrors, is Core Spirit. The word core actually was almost a cut for me. Like, that was the only thing that called out to me, is the fact that that doesn't have a creature type that makes sense to me, but the fact that it was a spirit, I allowed it. But when Skyclave Apparition enters the battlefield, exile up to 1 target non-land, non-token permanent you don't control with converted mana cost 4 or less. When Skyclave Apparition leaves the battlefield, the exiled card's owner creates an XX blue illusion creature token, where X is the converted mana cost of the card exiled this way, and it's a 2/2. So when I presented that to my group, and we've got some new players that have played this outside of that environment, they had a lot of pushback on that particular statement because they felt like that aligns to the theme for a multitude of reasons. Because it deals with planeswalkers, it deals with like some serious major threats that go past I guess typically the 3 mana value. When you start getting into the 4 power and toughness type of subgrouping of creatures, right? The converted mana cost of 4. You really start getting into my mid-range threats that are relevant. So this card, taking this one and putting it inside of a platter, may I present this to you? Is this a good Magic card?
I think that it is merely okay. I think that there are better options, but what it does is significant. It is not an insignificant card.
I would agree with that. But the preordained or the expectation of the bias is because it existed in the moto, therefore it must be good. And that is the challenge that I run into as a curator. So I'm not trying to build an Innistrad cube no more than I'm trying to build a Kaladesh or Mirrodin cube. I'm trying to build a power expanded, high power band cubes, in the case of like Mystic Confluence and these other cards, Cryptic Commands, I don't care which one you pick, that push the boundaries of the sets, like really push them. And if I would go so far as to say, if a player chooses to, while in a draft, pick cards that are the highest power and remove themselves or absolve themselves from the story, I can't see that as the curator, right? That's like someone just, I guess, finding the best maneuvers to do within said game and playing it. But then the diversity of a 360 cube in an 8-player draft is that the pieces of the pie are divvied out, right? So it's percentages within percentages. So if I go to Uber's Artifact Cube and someone passes, in the case where we talked about it with Dan Schneider, it was kind of a little bit of the lulls. He had this preordained idea that Selesnya was the most powerful package based on the 2022, I guess, excerpt of the cube. Then he knew with inside information that if he drafted creatures that are impervious to naturalized effects while drafting all the disenchants, that he could take people off their game if they embraced the embodiment of the name of the cube, Uberbear's Artifact Cube. If they followed that lead, right? The horse to the water, if you will, right? For lack of better terms. And that's a strategy that I don't want to deter, but at the same time, when I presented Skyclave Apparition to my group, and there's about 5 new players in that group, outside of our normal, I guess, meta, they all agreed that this card has a form and function that removes itself from the cube that doesn't fit, just because it fits Moto cube or the MTGO cube, doesn't displace it from its viability within said environment. That it still has a total function. It checks theme. It deals with threats. Yes, it does get them efficiently, right? Semi-efficiently. It deals a lot of big threats. But at the end of the day, it's just a removal spell, a removal on stick. For me, yes, it can get planeswalkers, but it's kind of like a ravenous chupacabra of sorts, right? Where it costs X amount of value. It does things, but once you remove it, it kind of has that O-ring effect of replacing itself where they get something for the trade-off, right? And at the end of the day, it's just a 2-2. So going back to that statement, using the bias of Moto, I guess against, I don't want to use the word against, but I'm going to use it, like as the notion that this is the expectation of a horror cube, this doesn't belong. There's a lot of other cards in here where I'm pushing the boundaries of power, right? Because I don't want this to be an Innistrad light cube. I want this to be universes expanded. I'm trying to build my own plane here. It's a horrific place where no one wants to live, where vampires, werewolves, zombies, and all the ideas that come with Gothic horror exist. But then you as a player can navigate that and grab the pieces. You could play blue counter magic. You could take all the cryptic commands. You could take all the counter spells and stop everything from doing that. But those have limitations. Would you agree with that? Like there's a point of no return if you take too many of the removal and hand stripping and all that. You still have to win the game.
Right. And when it comes to this card in particular, I'm not saying it's a bad card, obviously. But when I say that there are better options, it comes with the little subtext that it depends on the environment. And the reality is that within your environment, it's only going to be as good as the thing that it's removing, if that makes sense.
That does.
And what's interesting about this is that a lot of people come from the Moto Vintage Cube type environment. And a lot of people have that expectation on cubes in general. So when they see this high variation of power between cards that are functionally strong and then a lot of like weaker filler cards, and I don't mean filler in a derogatory way, but rather a power differential type way, it can be jarring as a drafter. So my pushback question here, well, question / statement / etc. is that when you're putting these cards in, what lanes are you trying to push your drafters into with them? Is there a specific goal in mind?
Yes. So let's pick apart Cryptic Command and Force of Will and Mystic Confluence. Let's do this.
Right.
So Cryptic Command, because these are going to be your like ones that people looked at it and they would say that this doesn't fit your genre. My expectations, me as the drafter, assuming that this is an Innistrad world, and I'm going to tell you that it's not, but this is what I'm thinking. I'm going with a couple of things. So in my world that I'm thinking as the writer of said world is that there's powerful mages with this environment, and some of them are going to be a lot more pushed than others, right? Like a werewolf doesn't match like a spell slinger in my world. They're just not there. I'm writing you a piece of fiction as we speak, right? So Force of Will, let's go that one first, is for 3 colorless, 2 blue, an instant, and you may pay 1 life and exile a blue card from your hand rather than paying the spell's mana cost, counter target spell. So we've talked about this card on numerous occasions, and my good friend Chris Samich and I have had some recent conversations about it. And I'm a firm believer that this is a highly scalable card. As you mentioned previously, that this card is based on what are you trying to counter, right? Like that, this is the expectation of this card. Like you're not dealing with, there was a once was where in this environment there were Grizzlybrands and stuff like that. So this card would have had a lot more value, but now we're taking the tonnage and pushing it back. And so it brings this card's value down a lot, because even though this is a pushed environment, this isn't stopping you from storming out, etc., right?
Right.
You get the idea, right? It's not the next level stuff. You're not casting sneak attack or whatever you're casting in the Moto Vintage Cube. If we go to Cryptic Command, and for 1 colorless and 3 blue, which has pretty much made you a blue mage in this cube, so you've made a choice, instant, choose 2, counter target spell, return target permanent to its owner's hand, tap all creatures your opponents control, or draw a card. So you have a lot of modality within that, but you've heavily invested as being the blue mage in the gothic horror genre to make this thing happen. Like there's a real cost here. You've chosen to go this lane, and it's not, I don't have the triomes and all those things that really makes your mana hugely diverse to make this, like, I don't want to say splashable, but you can't just play this in the old deck. You've really committed to the color blue, right? And it may dominate during certain games, but then I guess the crushing aspect of the horror cube is while you're doing all these things and you're trying to be the fancy blue mage, which is great, you still have to deal with the incremental damage, say, of the aristocrats from the Blood Arst effects and those push things that are getting through, or even the werewolves, right? They're really pushing through that strong mid-range package, challenging your position. So you as the drafter still need these cards to stay alive, right? These are almost... These are reactive cards, although they could be proactive with tapping your stuff down, I guess, for that lethal attack. But most of the time, these cards really play into someone's cast something and I can't deal with this, right? And the grand crescendo of this idea, why I'm running these cards, Mystic Confluence, Force of Will, Cryptic Command, Memory Lapse, Mana Leak, just picking apart these blue cards that also go in the Moto, is because I needed some survivability for certain types of playstyles that are in this environment that aren't as aggressive. So within this environment, my aggro is represented by the vampires, and now even the werewolves really push hard, right? So how do you make self-mill and things like that survive at a higher level? How do you push them to their limit so that they can actually hit the Labman or the Jace Wielder of Mystery strategy? You needed these type of components that says tap down all your creatures. No, you cannot cast that. I don't want you to cast this big threat that really pressures me. So what you were asking what my design intent was, is I wanted some power maximum cards, but I also wanted to take these set design, I guess, Innistrad-like type environments, like I want to do self-mill or whatever. And in my opinion, they're a lot more dirtily in their limited environments, and I wanted to push them up, right? I want players to see that. Does that make sense?
I can see your reasoning. I do have a specific example in mind, just to divert a bit from specifically those. In the Fate Cube, I have Nalia de Arnis, which is 1 white-black legendary creature human rogue 3/3. You may look at the top card of your library at any time. If you may cast cleric, rogue, warrior, and wizard spells from the top of your library, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you have a full party, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, and those creatures gain Death Touch. So, players were able to accurately assess, this is a power outlier. I made that lane very clear of party exists in this environment. It is the ideal thing, and when people see Nalia, it is a strong card to push people into that party lane. So, me as the curator, I can't be surprised when the party deck ends up being one of the most dominant strategies at the CubeCon, right? And it's not a matter of, I don't feel that its power is appropriate in terms of the environment, but rather other things probably just needed to be buffed. And when we have a card like this that is such an outlier, like basically having a 3/3 that gets you sometimes an additional card off your library is huge, but also, once you have a full party, this thing is hard to stop in my environment. And I've had to consider taking it out a couple times, but every time I haven't, because what it's encouraging and the lane that I have fostered, I think is natively a good thing. So when I'm asking about specifically what are you trying to convey to your players, Nalia is an example here where I'm very explicitly showing, hey, here's your big, dumb, powerful card that rewards you for being in party. That is the lane that people are getting rewarded for when they choose this card, either pack one, pick one, or later down the road when they have just a bunch of party creatures. And when you have generically playable cards like Force of Will, Cryptic Command, etc., a lot of those themes that require that external piece, that external storytelling, it kind of gets lost in translation for a lot of players, and that is a difficult line to walk. And it is hard when I am just going to say it how it is, and when you have these cards, I just don't think that it is true that they are flavor inappropriate. They can absolutely be transferred as an idea of, oh, well, it's the Elder Taurors that's making this cryptic command, and you're working your way through it, or Force of Will, you are literally dominating your opponent right now through powerful ancient magic, or whatever. That can appropriately fit within your themes. But when it comes to translating the functionality of the cards, sometimes that functionality overtakes what you're trying to convey. So it comes back around to, in terms of taste, the customer is always right.
I would agree with that. So like it's kind of like, you remember the game like, what was it, Minesweeper or whatever, where you clicked on the stuff, well, this is a grid. And my cube is a grid. And some of these are going to be bombs and some of these are just going to be blank slots, right? And but overarching the grid is the sum of its pieces when you're making the decisions. And for those people that played that game, Minesweeper, you would go through and you would click and it would tell you that within this grid there was one, and then you click this is within two. It's an old Windows game. That's a lot like when I'm looking at the 360 mapped out version of Uber's Horror Cube, for example. Not every card is going to be the most powerful card. Some of these are going to be very divergent, as in it's not as strong. If I take two cards and I put them side by side, and I take Blood Crazed Neonate, for one colorless and one red, I get a creature vampire. Blood Crazed Neonate attacks each turn. That's already problematic. It's a 2/1. But when Blood Crazed Neonate deals combat damage to a player, put a 1/1 counter on it. If I take that card and I roll it up beside this card, Stromkirk Noble, for one red, so it already has a reduced mana cost, creature vampire, Stromkirk Noble can't be blocked by humans. When Stromkirk Noble deals combat damage to a player, put a 1/1 counter on it, and it's a 1/1. I ran these two cards for the flavor purposes, and it looks strange when I do them by cross comparison of Moto Vintage Cube cards, right? Like, why run a card like Mystic Confluence? Why run a Dig Through Time? Why run these cards? Because they have these external expectations that are attached to them, that this is powered, or let's go back to Skyclave Apparition. It has an expectation because it appeared on the Moto, therefore it must be powerful. By comparison, there's a weird juxtaposition that I acknowledge and have always known that doesn't match Blood Crazed Neonate. They're not in the same vein. But one card is the aggro aspect in context of the environment. When you attack with the 2/1, you keep hitting, the blue mage is being put under a lot of pressure to deal with the situation, right? Like, it's constantly pressuring them, or the Stromkirk Noble, or whatever. These cards are incrementally getting larger, and you as the blue mage have to deal with it. You have to have something if you want to go in that vein, and that's where Cryptic Command, using the tap all creatures your opponents control, for example, or in the case of Mystic Confluence, return target creature to its owner's hand, repeat 3 times, right? Those cards actually seem out of context, but they have a purpose when you're under this large amount of pressure from these creatures that are coming at you sideways. So if you want to do the turn sideways creature aspect of Magic, you're more than welcome to embrace that. But the blue mage has to have defensive measures or countermeasures, in my opinion, to be able to combat that, and that's where these cards come in and have reach. But because of their context to the vintage Moto cube, people see these as I could just weave through that Minesweeper type of avenues and choose these Manaleeks and all these cards, right? And Inquisition of Kozilek and all these cards. And I could play a very powerful control mechanism, which I embrace the fact that you do that. But for those other readers that want to go in and try to do the Blood Artist and Bloodghast and all these things that they want to kind of do these aristocratic effects, I'm also not stopping them too. I'm giving somebody a little bit of taste of everything they want. Does that make sense? That's what I'm trying to do as a curator. That's my Universes Beyond, is to push those thresholds.
It's hard as a curator because we want to appeal to a lot of different players, and we want to create the aha moments that these player archetypes, call back to that episode, are interested in playing. And when we are trying to craft it for everyone to find something, the problem is that you can't please everyone all of the time. It's that classic expression where it's like, you can please everyone some of the time. You can please some people all of the time, but you can't please everyone all of the time. And it is a case in cube curation where we have to specifically curate what people are actually drafting and playing in a way so that way people continue playing and they continue keeping interest. They seek their teeth in. And what's hard with a lot of your cases that has been feedback, and a lot of the themes and ideas from top down ends up getting lost in translation, and that is hard because you have a specific vision in mind. You had exactly the idea of how you wanted to execute it and how you wanted to craft this kind of metagame interaction. But like you said earlier, lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink type of situation. And when people are looking at this,
I apologize for cutting it, but interestingly enough, when I reviewed the CubeCon data on the 3-0 win rates, the spectrum was broad and vast on what won. So, like Uber's Artifact Cube, I was shocked and awed and slightly amazed that I did not see Selesnya sitting at the top anymore. Right? It was some blue, some red, and some Selesnya. So, like, it had diversity spread across those different junctions of the cube. It wasn't like one deck wins. It wasn't like red deck wins. This is the deck to beat. This is what you're dealing with. Or white weenie is always going to win in Moto, whatever. It didn't play that way. And then another thing that's interesting too, and I want to ask this question of you, is my meta gets my group of friends, and that'd be Chris and Christian and Greg and Avram and all this group, right? And Stu, etc. Sam. Is they understand the storytelling aspect, so they play to that. Like, these cubes are designed for them, and they like these power-pushed thematic cubes opposed to set cubes that are following the strict preordained notions of this is Kaladesh, this is Mirrodin, this is what you do, right? This is Innistrad, this is Expectation, the counter magic, it plays to the strengths of Innistrad, etc., right? That's not what I'm trying to make here. I'm trying to make power-pushed environments to take those themes and break them outside their molds. What are your thoughts on that?
So, I think that it is a good way to break expectations for people, but I will also ask whether or not it is something that we have to improve on as curators to better convey our intentions, or if it is a case that the thing that we are curating is too mixed of signals, if that makes sense.
I would agree with that 100%. So, kind of taking this and summarizing it, I think as curators, you can understand specifically the challenges of building a world, right? Like, there's definitely struggles to happen with that. And taking the context that's accepted within your compartmentalized meta, let's say your players of 6, 8, 12 players that you play with on a day-to-day basis, and then taking something that you've crafted, in the case of the Munson Cube, where it required metal music to really get the theme and a little bit of bourbon to really make it drive it home, so it wasn't just a Jun Cube, right? It would become flattened. So the storytelling elements are directly correlated to that idea. So as presented, it gets the story can get washed out by the tides, right? Whereas when you present it to a larger group, what are the expectations? What are the feedback? And how do you process that, right? And I want, at the end of the day, and I think Chris Samich said this best, right? Feedback is feedback, and you as a curator are building this as your form of expression. And you can take some anecdotes from it and process it and do that. But ultimately, the game environment is for your circle, right? It's for the people that you play with regularly. And I don't mean to emphasize that, but when you present this outside of that vacuum of the group of people that you play with on a day-to-day basis, you can see where the context of something like the Munson Cube would just become a Jun Cube if I made it to a 360 and presented it to CubeCon. Do you have any thoughts on that, May?
It's like I stated before, is that it's hard without those external components. And when we take things out of the vacuum of our playgroup, where they're already used to it, we've already been through the shtick and we don't have to explain it every time, versus when we have a new audience, it is hard to convey the things that we have already established within our playgroup. And it's hard when you're only playing within that vacuum, so to speak. So
I would agree with that. And so it really comes down to is you as a curator deciding who's your audience, right? Like the reader-writer relationship that we talked about, who are you presenting this to? So and I encourage you, I 100% encourage you, if you're a listener, to take your thoughts, take your ideas, and present them to CubeCon 2024, right? Like, don't let the constructive criticism is challenging, and you have to process that, and you have to make improvements, and you have to come outside of your bubble. But then there's positive aspects of that idea too, right? You're putting yourself out there. And that can be scary, right? That can be scary, May. Like doing the thing you've never done before. Yeah.
I have a very specific adage. I don't think anybody else has said it except for me, but I'm just going to say it now, is that there are no bad cubes, just cubes that could be better.
I agree with that. So there's always opportunity for improvement. And how do you curate that improvement? Well, that comes down to the critical feedback and the constructive criticism and taking these stories into context, as we did with the apparition versus the force of will versus the ancient tomb, which I 100% agree with because it was a known entity. But other than that, we're going to move over to our socials. So if you love the show, you can actually consider giving a 5-star review on your favorite player. Also, UberCube is an affiliate with Ultra Sleeves. If you use our code, you get 5% off your purchase at www.ultrasleeves.com/UberCube. Also, we've talked about this on numerous occasions. I am the shared administrator with the MTG Cube Drafting Facebook page, which is a wonderful group where you can come on and talk about your pack one, pick ones, all the things you love about Cube, find podcasts, resources, etc. If you're not into the vibe of all the other ones, I would say that this, in my opinion, is the reason why I use Facebook at this point, for not many other reasons besides that. But yeah, birthdays, sure. But if you also want to support the show, please use our Inked Gaming affiliate, where you can get your playmats, your dice bags, your mouse pads, etc. This is where we got our UberCube mats from. I absolutely adore everything they do about it. The stitching's wonderful. We talked about this on numerous occasions, where at CubeCon 2023, we had all the UberCube mats on the table. They just looked glorious, and it was a wonderful picture. And you can also find us at Twitter at UberCubeMTGPod. You can also reach us at UberCubeMTGPodcast@gmail.com. You can also link us on Discord, which our Discord's popping, it's homing. We love to have conversation there. And as Stu has mentioned on numerous occasions, we love the Deck Boast channel that Stu added, like where people can come in and be braggadocious about their good decks and their bad decks and kind of explain what their context was, right? Like it's the thing that says, I built this deck. It was designed by Jace Wielder of Mysteries. I wanted it to do all these things and it didn't work out, right? That's okay. Throw it up on the Discord. And then we also have a Patreon. It's patreon.com/UberCube. You can find us on there. It is amazing. And I want to thank our Patreons. That would be Preston, that would be Steven, that would be Sam, and Nick. I appreciate all of you and what you've done to help support the show. We love our Patreons. May, do you have anything to say or jingle for our Patreons?
We appreciate the Patreons.
Other than that, we're going to do the thing that we always do here at UberCube, and we're going to say,
Happy cubing!